you join me in prayer this morning? God, as your written word becomes a spoken word, let it be a living word for each and every one of us. Amen. One Sunday morning, a woman walked out of her church after a particularly uplifting worship service, and she bumped into a man who was standing outside the church looking up at the cross on top of the church steeple. She excused herself and started to walk away. But the man called to her, asking, as he pointed to the church she had been a member of most of her life, he said, "Tell me, what is it that you believe in there?" She started to answer and then realized that she didn't know the answer or didn't know how to articulate the right response. And as she stood there trying to compose an appropriate answer, the man said almost dismissively, "Never mind, I'm sorry if I bothered you." And then he walked away. Well, she quickly realized that he had bothered her, and that story ought to bother us this morning and make us wonder how we would answer that question, what is it that we believe in here? Is it that Jesus is Lord? That if you do good works and give to those in need, that heaven is your guarantee? That if we come to church and give of our time, talent, and treasures, that God will reward us in this life? What is it that you believe? Well, in our gospel readings this morning, Jesus is that man standing outside the church, asking, "What do you believe?" And Jesus asked this question of his disciples as he is making his final journey to Jerusalem. The same disciples who have witnessed miracles no one has ever seen or heard of before. They've seen demons and nature itself obey his commands. And Jesus has not only been healing and performing miracles, but Jesus has been teaching his disciples and sharing with them lessons on obedience, faithfulness, discipleship, and the difference between what we say about our faith and how we should live out our faith in our everyday lives. And every now and then, Jesus throws in what is the deep fear of every student there ever was, the pop quiz, to see how well the disciples understand what he is saying and doing. And of course, Jesus can't hide his deep disappointment with how consistently his disciples simply don't get it. There's the time Jesus proclaims himself the bread of life and says that people will have to eat of his flesh and drink of his blood if they want to have eternal life. And the disciples are like, "What?" Or the time when thousands have followed them, hungry to hear the life-giving words of Jesus. But when the crowd becomes physically hungry and need food to eat, the disciples say, "Well, what do you want from us? We don't have enough money to feed them all, so let's send them away to find food on their own." At every turn, the disciples miss what Jesus wants them to get, to learn, to know, and to understand. So it isn't much of a surprise that the disciples become a bit anxious when Jesus throws out another pop quiz in Caesarea Philippi, asking them this time not about the law or some doctrine of the faith, but about himself. And what Jesus asks is, "Who do people say that I am?" And now the disciples are relieved, because this is a question they have answers for. "John the Baptist," one of them answers enthusiastically. "Some of them say that you are John the Baptist." "Elijah," says another. "I've heard some say you are the prophet Elijah." Ooh, I know the answer to this one. "I've heard some say you could be Jeremiah or one of the other prophets returned from the dead." And you can just imagine how pleased they are with themselves that they finally have good, solid answers for Jesus. But you and I know how easy it is to simply repeat something you've heard. You know, like, well, this isn't what I think or I believe, but I've heard some people say this, that, or the other. So the disciples have given their answers to what they've heard others say about Jesus, and now they're waiting for Jesus to tell them which of their answers is the correct one. But of course, Jesus doesn't give them an answer. But what Jesus does is to turn the question on to them, to those with whom he has spent the most time and shared the best of himself. Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" One of my favorite preachers, Barbara Brown Taylor, says, she wishes the Bible had come down to us like a musical score, with all the pauses written in, or like a script of a play that tells us what happens when nothing is happening or being said. Because she says it would be helpful to our understanding of the Bible to have stage directions. Something like, and at center stage, as soon as Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" all of the disciples look away. Some of them start studying the backs of their hands. Others kick aside little piles of dirt. And still others are simply studying their sandaled feet. Who knows how long the silence stretched between the question, "Who do you say that I am?" and the silence-breaking response was before Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Peter, courageous Peter. Right or wrong, Peter is always the first one out of the gate, the first one to offer his opinion, the first one to leave his fishnet and follow Jesus. Peter is the first and only disciple to step out of the boat to walk on water to Jesus. Peter, thank God for Peter. But sometimes it's hard to say whether Peter is courageous or just crazy. But in this case, Peter's answer is apparently the one Jesus is looking for. And so Jesus blesses Peter, giving Simon a new name, Petra, Peter, which means rock. And then Jesus declares that on this rock I will build my church, a church so inclusive, so expansive, and so filled with energy and spirit that not even the gates of hell will be able to destroy it. And Jesus says that because of the church, there will be no more barriers between heaven and earth. A yes on earth will be a yes in heaven, and a no on earth will be a no in heaven. Wow. Just look at what Peter unleashes with his, not his, right answer. And Jesus tells Peter that he, Peter, is the inheritor of the keys to the kingdom. I bet those other disciples didn't even know there were keys to the kingdom. But while Peter's answer to the question, "Who do you say that I am?" seems to be the right answer, it is not really his answer. Because Jesus tells Peter, "Peter, wow, you are blessed, but you didn't get this answer from books or from professors or from any other humans. This answer was revealed to you by my Father in heaven." Which of course is a little like saying, "Blessed are you for an answer that you did not come up with." But if it wasn't Peter's answer, then why is Peter blessed for giving it? Peter's sudden promotion must have seemed a bit odd to the other disciples. After all, they know Peter. And this is Peter, the first and only person other than Jesus to walk on water. But then, Peter is also the only one who sank in the middle of his walk to Jesus. And while Peter might have been the first with his hand in the air with a bold pronouncement, Peter did not always follow through on his bold pronouncements. And then just after receiving both a new name and a special blessing, Jesus rebukes Peter when Peter argues with Jesus about what is going to happen to him when they get to Jerusalem. And Jesus is so angry with Peter that Jesus calls him another name, Satan, saying to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block in my journey." So Peter goes from being a cornerstone of the church to being a stumbling block in Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and the cross, and ultimately to the resurrection. So what does this all mean? How can Peter be the inheritor of the keys to the kingdom one minute and the devil himself in Jesus' way the next? And what in the world are we supposed to learn from impulsive, opinionated Peter? The same Peter who, when push came to shove, denies Jesus altogether. I mean, about all that can be said in Peter's defense is that Peter is willing to take risks. Risk going first, risk speaking up, risk stepping out, and that when and if he steps out or speaks up and says the wrong things or fails miserably or falls down flat, Peter manages to pick himself up, brush himself off, and keep moving forward in his faith. While the other disciples seem to hang back in fear of doing the wrong things or giving wrong answers, Peter steps out and risks giving an answer, and in this case, his answer turns out to be just what Jesus needed and wanted to hear as he is making his final journeys to Jerusalem. And so Jesus tells Peter, "You are a rock." Actually, he calls him a small rock. This is a small rock. And a small rock is nothing but a piece of a bigger rock. In this case, the bigger rock is what we call the Rock of Ages, which of course means Peter is a chip off the old block, a piece of the rock to whom we go to for our salvation. Peter is blessed and receives the keys to the kingdom, not because of anything he says or does, but because his answer is God's answer. Peter is blessed because of his relationship with the eternal God of the universe, and it is on that relationship Jesus proclaims God's church is built. God's church is not built on whether we have the right answers or not, or on anything that you or I say, but God's church is built on nothing less than the blood of Jesus and his righteousness. The church of God is built on the same Jesus who in his infinite wisdom called a bullheaded, short-tempered, stubborn, never-say-die rock named Peter to help build his church. Peter doesn't have a flawless character. He isn't an intellectual giant. He isn't even deeply spiritual. But what Peter is willing to step out and speak up about his faith. And that ought to encourage us this morning. Isn't it great to know that it's Peter who is guarding the very gates of heaven? Because it just may be that when and if you get to the gates of heaven, someone like Peter will be there and just might understand someone like you, someone who finds it hard to come up with answers to the great questions of our lives. Someone like Peter might understand someone who says things and then regrets having said it, or does the wrong things and then regrets having done it. Someone like Peter might be there and he just might understand someone like you who can't seem to keep the faith in tough and testing times. This is Peter, the same Peter who declares, "Jesus, I would die before I would deny you." And then who denies Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times, saying, "I don't even know who he is." If Peter is the rock on which the church is built, then there is hope. Hope for you and hope for me. Because Peter is us. And Peter remains the rock when he is a cornerstone and when he is a stumbling block. And because what Peter shows us is that being a rock is less about perfectness than it is about willingness. That what counts is to risk stepping out, speaking up, and giving an answer. And risking getting it wrong, but getting up again and again and again when we fall or fail. You know, Peter's last encounter with Jesus takes place after the resurrection. And after Jesus shares another last meal with his disciples. And as soon as the meal is over, Jesus turns to Peter and asks, not once, not twice, but 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And Peter answers 3 times, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And not once, not twice, but 3 times, Jesus says, then feed my sheep. And perhaps the answer Jesus seeks from those whom he came to give his life for and called to be his followers is not so much an answer that is spoken as it is an answer that we live out, an answer that demands action. Because the real truth about who Jesus is shows up not on our lips, but in our lives. Not in our words, but on our hearts. Not in what we believe, but what we do about our beliefs. That is why I am so excited about what our outreach board is challenging us to do. And that is to reimagine the Norfield Fair. To reimagine our fair as a day of service to our community, because a day of service is a reminder that we gather in this sacred space, not simply to celebrate our faith with one another, but to be energized to share our faith in real and tangible ways. I call it tangibilitating the gospel. And because we are, all of us are, a piece of the rock of our salvation, we are the stones that the builders rejected. We are the church. We are the church. We are God's church. And we've been entrusted with the keys to the kingdom of heaven, against which the very powers of death and hell cannot and will not prevail. Go out, go forth, make a difference in our world. Amen. Amen.